Wind howled down from Cutbank Ridge, carrying the scent of dying grass and wood smoke. Iron wheels ground against the frozen ruts of the road. A tall woman stood at the well, sleeves shoved to her elbows, hauling rope, hand over hand until her shoulders burned. Sweat froze on her back in the October cold. She heard the wagon before she saw it. That particular rattle made her chest tighten. The wagon stopped near the house. A man in a coat too fine for the land climbed down, smiling without warmth. He threw back the canvas tarp. Beneath it lay a giant of a man, legs bound in crude splints, dark with blood, beard matted. His eyes were pale as January creek ice, open, watching her. No plea, no fear. Just a banked fury that looked almost calm. The driver grabbed him under the arms and heaved. The body hit the frozen dirt with a heavy, final thud. Frost and dust rose around him. He made no sound. His jaw locked tight. She set the bucket down, wiped her hands on her apron. The wind cut through her shirt. She took one slow step toward him. Those pale eyes never left her face. The wind came down off Cutbank Ridge that morning, carrying the smell of dying grass and wood smoke, and Odessa Vane stood at the well, with her sleeves shoved to the elbow, hauling rope hand over hand until her shoulders burned. Sweat stuck her shirt to her back, even in the cold, because that was October in Millbrook Ridge, hot in the sun, ice in the shade, never anything in between. She was 31 years old, and built like something the land itself had made on purpose, tall enough to look most men square in the eye. Broad through the shoulders in a way that made her late husband's coat still fit her better than it ever fit him. She hauled the bucket up, set it on the stone lip, and rested her forearms there a moment, just breathing. Just letting the ache settle into her bones where it lived now, permanent as marrow. The farm stretched out behind her in every direction, brown and tired. The wheat stubble from a thin harvest still standing in crooked rows, because she hadn't found the hours to burn it off yet. 3 years she'd been running this place alone. 3 winters of chopping her own wood, mending her own fences, birthing her own calves when the weather turned mean. And there was nobody to send for. She'd stopped counting the ways her body had changed under that weight. The permanent stoop in her lower back. The calluses gone hard and yellow across her palms. The way her knees announced themselves now every morning, before her mind had even finished waking. She heard the wagon before she saw it. Iron wheels grinding the frozen ruts of the road. That particular rattle. She knew it the way she knew the sound of her own heartbeat, and she hated it the same helpless way too. Wade, her breath went shallow. Not from fear, from something worse. From the tired, bone-deep dread of a woman who has learned that nothing good ever comes up that road. She didn't turn around right away. Let him wait. Let the mules stamp and blow while she finished hauling the water, because if there was one thing Odessa Vane had left in this world, it was the right to finish her own chores on her own time. Morning, Odessa. Wade's voice always sounded like it was smiling even when his face wasn't. She turned, wiped her hands on her apron. Wade. That was all. One word. She'd learned a long time ago that giving him more than one word was giving him a foothold. He climbed down off the buckboard slow, like a man savoring something. His coat was too fine for a farmer. Too fine for anybody who worked for a living. He'd married into money once, lost it, and had been trying to marry back into it ever since her husband died, and left her the land instead of him. He was no kin of her husband's. Not by blood, nor by law. Just a man who'd circled this land for years, the way a buzzard circles a wounded animal, waiting for the moment it finally stopped moving. He'd courted her twice in the first year of her widowhood, both times with the same oily patience, both times leaving with the same thin smile, once she'd told him no. He hadn't proposed since. He'd simply started waiting instead, biding his time the way men like Wade always did. Certain that hunger and hard winters would do what charm never could. Brought you something, he said. I don't want it. You don't even know what it is. Don't matter. She picked up the bucket. Felt the muscles in her forearm pull tight around the handle. Anything you bring me costs more than it's worth. Wade laughed, that wet, easy laugh of a man who has never once paid for his own mistakes. He walked around to the back of the wagon and threw off a canvas tarp, and underneath it was a man. Odessa set the bucket down, slow. Careful, like her hands had stopped trusting themselves. He was enormous, even folded up the way he was in that wagon bed. Shoulders like a doorframe, 38 years old. By the look of the deep lines carved around his eyes, a face that had spent 2 decades reading weather and tracking game, long before it had any reason to read pain. A beard gone wild and matted with dried blood and mountain dust. His legs were wrapped crude in splinted wood, bound with strips of leather that had gone stiff and dark. A wool blanket, filthy, covered him from the waist down, and his eyes, pale as ice on a creek bed in January, open, watching her, not begging, not pleading, just watching, with a kind of fury banked so deep it looked almost like calm. Found him up past Widow's Notch, Wade said, like he was talking about a stray dog. Bear got him, tore his back up good. Doc says the legs are done, dead from the hip down, can't feel a thing. He leaned against the wagon wheel, arms crossed, pleased with himself in a way that made Odessa's stomach turn. Town council had a meeting. Figured, since you're all alone out here. No, and since you've got the size to manage a man's weight. I said no, Wade. It'd be a Christian mercy for you to take him in. There it was. The smile under the smile. The joke everyone in town was already laughing at somewhere she couldn't hear it. The big widow and the broken man. Let the winter finish what the bear started. Save the bank the paperwork of foreclosing on her land come spring. Odessa looked at the man in the wagon. He looked back. Neither one of them looked away first. I can't feed him, she said, and her voice came out flatter than she meant it to. Flatter than the fear underneath it. I can barely feed myself, Wade. You know that. Council's already decided. Wade's smile thinned out at the edges now. Less patient. He's your ward. Effective today. I never agreed to. You don't have to agree. He grabbed the man under the arms without waiting, without warning. Hauled him toward the tailgate, rough enough that a sound tore out of the man's throat, low, guttural, a sound like something breaking inside a chest that refused to break out loud. Council's already decided, Odessa. Take it up with them if you don't like it. He let go. The man hit the frozen dirt hard. Dust and frost kicked up around him. He didn't cry out. His jaw locked so tight the muscle in his cheek jumped. But he didn't cry out. And something about that, about the sheer stubborn refusal of it, hit Odessa somewhere she didn't have a name for yet. Wade climbed back up onto the buckboard. Tipped his hat like he'd just delivered a crate of dry goods. Enjoy the company, he said, and snapped the reins, and the wagon rattled off down the frozen road. And then it was just her and a stranger bleeding into her yard. She stood there a long moment, wind cutting through her shirt, because part of her, the tired part, the part that had been carrying this farm alone, for 3 years now on a back that screamed every single morning before she even got out of bed, that part of her wanted to walk inside. Lock the door. Let the cold take care of what Wade wouldn't. She was so tired of things dying on her watch. Her husband, her crops 2 years running. Her own name worn down to nothing but the widow Vane. Poor thing, big as a barn. No wonder nobody'll have her. She'd heard the whispers plenty of times, coming out of church, standing in line at the mercantile. The women who used to be her friends now speaking a little too loud when they thought her back was turned. She'd learned to let the words slide off her, the way rain slid off an oiled coat. Mostly, but then she looked at him. At the white-knuckled way his hands dug into the frozen dirt, trying, failing, to push himself up on arms that trembled with the effort. At the fury in that pale stare, aimed as much at himself as at the world, and she recognized it. She recognized the exact shape of that pride, because she wore the same one, every day, like armor 2 sizes too tight. I ain't dragging you, she said. Didn't ask you to. His voice came out a ruined rasp. Dry as a riverbed. In August, you'll die out here. Then I'll die out here. She almost laughed. Almost. Because that was the stupidest, stubbornest thing she'd heard in 3 years, and she'd heard some stupid things. Well, she said, walking toward him, you ain't dying in my yard. Frost'll ruin the grass come spring, and I need that grass. She bent down, ignored the protest in her lower back, the one that had been getting louder every winter since her husband passed. Grabbed him under the arms the way Wade had, except not rough, not careless, just strong. Steady, grab hold, she said. He hesitated. She watched him hesitate, watched the war happen behind those ice-pale eyes, pride against survival, and survival winning by the thinnest margin, and then his hands closed around her forearms, calloused. Strong even now, even broken. His grip nearly buckled her knees with the shock of it. On three, she said. One, she pulled. He was heavier than anything she'd hauled in years. Heavier than the hay bales. Heavier than the dead calf she'd dragged out of the mud last spring. Heavier than grief itself some days. She planted her boots, braced her whole body, dragged him backward across the frozen yard, one wrenching step at a time, while he gritted his teeth and made not one single sound. By the time they reached the porch steps, they were both gasping. She dropped him gentle as she could manage, which still wasn't gentle, and stood there with her hands on her knees, breath tearing out of her in white clouds. Name's Odessa, she managed, a long pause. Long enough she thought maybe he'd passed out. Garrick, he said finally. That was all. No thank you. No apology for the weight of him, for the blood already staining her porch boards, for the ruin he'd brought into her yard. Just his name, offered like a coin flipped onto a table, between two strangers, who both knew the game wasn't over. She hauled him inside. The first 3 days were the kind of ugly nobody ever put in a story. She moved him into the parlor, onto the old iron cot she dragged down from the attic, cursing the whole way, because the ladder wobbled, and her knees screamed, and there was nobody left alive who cared enough to help her carry anything anymore. Except now there was somebody in her house who couldn't help carry anything either. Which was its own kind of joke, she supposed. The kind Wade would have laughed at. The room took on his smell fast, fever sweat, old blood, the sour tang of a body that had been dying slow for days before anybody bothered to feed it. Odessa boiled rags, changed dressings, cleaned him with a wet cloth and a bucket of water gone cold within minutes, and every single time he stared straight up at a crack in the plaster ceiling, like if he looked hard enough it might swallow him whole. He never asked for gentleness. She never offered it. There wasn't time. There wasn't energy. There was only the work, the same as every other broken thing, on this farm. The fence post that needed resetting, the roof that needed patching, the man on the cot who needed turning so he didn't rot from lying still. On the second morning, she boiled willow bark for the fever, the way her grandmother had taught her, and forced it down his throat spoonful by spoonful while he glared at her, over the rim of the cup like she was trying to poison him. Tastes like tree bark, he muttered. It is tree bark. Then why in God's name would I drink it? Because the alternative's a pine box, mountain man, and I ain't got the lumber to spare. She pressed the cup back to his lips. Drink, he drank, grimacing the whole way, like a man forced to swallow his own pride, along with the medicine, which in a way he was your pulling the skin off. He snapped at her, one morning when she was changing the dressing on his shoulder. Low, furious, the kind of furious that isn't really about the skin at all. She dropped the rag in the bucket. Splash. Cold water on her wrist. Then grow yourself a new pair of legs, she said. And wash yourself, mountain man. Until then, you'll take what you're given and keep your mouth shut about how it's given. He glared at her. She glared back. Neither one of them looked away, because that was the thing nobody told you about caring for a broken man. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't tender candlelight and soft words. It was cold water and lye soap and a body that hated being touched by a stranger, and a woman too tired to be delicate about any of it. There was no bedside grace in it. Just survival, ugly and plain. Two people doing the only thing left to do. He watched her, though. She noticed that. Even sick, even half out of his mind with fever some nights, his eyes tracked her around the room. The way she moved, heavy-footed, but somehow never clumsy. The way she scraped every last spoonful of cornmeal mush off her plate, like it might be the last food she ever saw. The frayed hem of her dress. The bruised half-moons under her eyes. He expected pity from her. She could see it in the way he flinched whenever she came close, bracing for the soft voice, the sad eyes, the "oh, you poor thing" that the whole town seemed to reserve special for men who couldn't walk anymore. She never gave it to him. She looked at him the exact same way she looked at the water pump out back when it needed an extra hard crank to draw. Another broken thing, Another chore. Nothing more, nothing less. And something about that. About being looked at like a problem to solve, instead of a tragedy to mourn. Seemed to loosen something tight behind his ribs, even if neither one of them said so out loud. On the third night, unable to sleep, for the sound of his ragged breathing through the wall, she sat by the stove mending a shirt that didn't need mending, just to have something to do with her hands. Every so often, she'd hear him shift on the cot, the creak of old iron, a low grunt of pain quickly bitten back, and every time, some part of her would go rigid, listening, waiting to hear if this was the night it finally took him. It wasn't. Not yet. But it came close soon enough. The fever broke on the fourth night, but not before it nearly took him somewhere. Odessa couldn't follow. She'd been up since before dawn. Chickens. Firewood. The fence line down by the south pasture that kept sagging, no matter how many times she reset the posts. By nightfall, her whole body felt like something wrung out and hung to dry, and she collapsed into the rocking chair by the stove without even bothering to take her boots off first. That was when it started. Garrick's breathing changed. Went ragged. Fast. She was up out of the chair before she even fully registered why. Crossing the room, pressing the back of her hand to his forehead, and it was like touching a stove iron left too long in the fire. "No," she muttered. "No, no. No. Not tonight. I don't have the strength for tonight." She fetched water. Cool rags. Draped them over him while he thrashed weak against the blanket, muttering things that didn't make sense, things that came apart in her ears like smoke. Not the ridge. Watch the ridge. She wrung out another cloth, pressed it to his throat. Should have seen it coming, should have. His shot out, grabbed her wrist, grip like iron even now, even wasted with fever, and for one heart-stopping second she thought he might break the bone. "Crane," he rasped, eyes still closed. Somewhere else entirely. Somewhere up on that mountain, in whatever hour it was that had done this to him. "Crane, you son of a..." Then his grip went slack. His breathing evened, just barely, just enough. He'd slipped back down into something quieter, something almost like sleep, and Odessa sat there in the dark, with her wrist still tingling from the shape of his fingers, turning that one word over and over in her mind like a stone she couldn't put down. Crane. Not the bear's name. Not a place. A person's name, said the exact way you'd say the name of a man who'd done something to you that a bear never could. She looked at the splinted mess of his legs, at the ragged wound scarring up along his shoulder blade, the one she'd been cleaning every day, the one Doc had written off as a claw mark in his letter to the council. She'd cleaned enough wounds in her life to know the difference between a claw and a blade. Her husband had cut himself once on a broken plow blade, deep, jagged, and she remembered exactly the way it had looked healing. Nothing at all like the clean, deliberate scarring across Garrick's shoulder. She'd told herself she was wrong, told herself grief made a person see things that weren't there but sitting in the dark. With his fingerprints still burning pale on her wrist, she wasn't so sure anymore. "Who's Crane?" she whispered. To nobody. To the dark. To the crack in the ceiling. He liked to stare at so hard nobody answered. She stayed up the rest of that night, watching the rise and fall of his chest, counting his breaths the way she'd once counted her husband's, in the last week of his own illness. Terrified in a way she didn't fully understand yet that this stranger she'd dragged in off the frozen ground might slip away from her too, leaving her with nothing but another grave to dig and another silence to fill. By the fifth night, the fever had broken for good, and something in the house had shifted, though neither of them would have called it by name. Odessa came in from the cold with an armful of firewood, dumped it by the stove, and found him propped against the wall on the cot, watching her with those winter-pale eyes, more alert now than she'd seen him yet. "You're staring," she said. "I'm looking." "Same thing." "No, it ain't." His voice had steadied some. Less rasp, more gravel. "Staring's what folks do at a freak show. Looking's just looking," she snorted. Almost a laugh. "Wouldn't let it become one. Well, keep your looking to yourself. Mountain man. I've got chores." She turned to go. His voice stopped her at the doorway. "Odessa." She turned back. First time he'd said her name since that first night on the porch. It landed somewhere in her chest she didn't expect. Thank you, he said, rough, like the word cost him something physical to say, for pulling me off that road. I know what that wagon ride was supposed to be. She stood there a second, considered a dozen things to say, landed on the plainest one. Wasn't for you, she said. Was for the grass. But she didn't leave right away. And he didn't look away first, and outside. The wind kept howling against the shutters, but for the first time in 3 days, the house didn't feel quite so much like a place two people had come to die. That evening she brought him a bowl of the same thin stew she ate herself. No better, no worse, and sat with him a while as he worked through it slow, testing his own hands with each spoonful like a man relearning a skill. You'll be wanting a chair, she said eventually. Something you can move yourself in. I ain't got the back to be your legs from now till the ground thaws. Didn't ask you to be. I know it. I'm offering anyway. She stood, took the empty bowl from him. There's wagon wheels rusting behind the coop. Old kitchen stool with a broke leg in the shed. Give me a few days. I'll cobble something together. He looked at her a long moment. Something unreadable moving behind those pale eyes. Why? He said finally. She considered the question longer than it probably deserved. Because a man with nothing to do but stare at a crack in my ceiling is a man who'll drive us both half mad before Christmas, she said. And because a chair's cheaper than losing my mind. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed his face, gone almost before it arrived. Fair enough, he said. The rain came hard 2 nights later, hammering the tin roof, thunder cracking so close it rattled the window glass in its frame. Odessa had spent the whole day out patching the chicken coop roof, and she came in soaked through, mud to her knees, hair plastered flat against her skull. She dropped into the rocking chair without a word, peeled off her boots one at a time, groaning at the ache in her lower back, and let her head fall against the wood. Eyes shut, too tired even to be embarrassed by how she must look, Garrick lay on the cot, watching her from beneath half-lowered lids. His throat was dry. There was a tin cup on the stool beside him, filled hours ago. And he'd been too proud to ask her to refill it, and now his pride was about to cost him. He reached for it anyway. Stretched his upper body across the narrow cot, fingers straining, and for 1 second he almost had it. And then his balance betrayed him the way it always did now, without the anchor of legs to hold him steady, and he pitched sideways. The cup went flying, clattered against the floorboards. Water spread dark across the wood. He froze, braced for it, braced for the exhausted fury of a woman who'd already given him everything she had left to give. Odessa opened her eyes, looked at the cup, looked at him, rigid, humiliated, jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. And then, slow, she pushed herself back up, out of the rocking chair, knees popping loud in the quiet room. She didn't say a word, walked to the kitchen, fetched a rag, came back and knelt beside the cot, mopping up the water without so much as a sigh. I was reaching for it, he said, defensive, almost a growl. I know, she said. That was all. She stood, refilled the cup at the pitcher, and brought it back, held it out to him. He hesitated. Pride again, always pride. The last thing a man had left when everything else had been stripped off him. And then he took it, his knuckles brushing hers, her skin rough and warm against his. You spill that one, she said, flat, no cruelty in it at all. You're licking it off the floor yourself. Something in his chest cracked open, just slightly. A breath of a laugh escaped him before he could stop it. Fair enough, he muttered. She sat back down. Didn't look at him with soft eyes. He didn't offer her a grateful smile. But the silence between them, while the storm beat itself out against the roof, wasn't sharp anymore. It wasn't barbed wire. It was just quiet. Two exhausted, broken, stubborn people, sitting out the same storm. You had a wife, she said eventually. Not quite a question. Up in the mountains. No, he turned the cup slow between his hands. Never had the time to want one. Traps don't tend themselves, and a man chasing elk through snowdrifts half the year makes for a poor husband to anybody. No kin, then, waiting on you. Somewhere, none living. Something closed over his face, brief and hard. Had a partner instead. Man who was as close to kin as I ever kept. She didn't push further. Some doors, she'd learned, opened easier when you didn't lean on them. I had a husband, she offered instead, unprompted, surprising herself with it. 3 winters gone now. Good with a plow. Not so good with kindness. Garrick looked at her a long moment. His loss, he said simply, and turned his face toward the window. And neither of them said anything more that night, but something had been traded between them all the same. One small true thing for another. The first coin either of them had spent freely since the wagon rattled up her road. The weeks that followed turned the farm into something closer to a rhythm than a battlefield. Odessa built him a chair, ugly, groaning, cobbled together out of salvaged wagon wheels, and an old kitchen stool. And once he had it, once he could haul himself into it using the strength still left in those massive arms, something in him changed. He wasn't just a body on a cot anymore. He was a man with a task. He fixed things, give him a broken bit of harness, a dull blade, a length of frayed rope, and his hands remembered 100 nights spent mending gear alone by a campfire, on some ridge she'd never see. He didn't have his legs, but God, he had his hands, and watching him work, watching the fierce, quiet focus settle over his face while he worked a whetstone against steel. Odessa began to understand something. He wasn't a burden. He was a craftsman who'd been dumped into her yard like garbage, and the town of Millbrook Ridge hadn't had the sense to see what they were throwing away. He mended the plow harness first, then the broken hinge on the coupe door, then a fence panel she'd been meaning to fix for the better part of a year and never found the hours for. Each finished task he set aside without comment, without waiting for praise. The way a man sets aside a stone he's carried a long way and finally set down. One evening, deep into a cold snap, her late husband's leather kit spread open across her lap. She found herself losing a fight with a stiff old harness strap. The awl slipped, bit deep into the meat of her thumb. She hissed, pressed the wound to her apron, and for one raw second, felt the whole crushing weight of the winter bear down on her all at once. "Bring it here," Garrick said. "I don't have time for. Bring it here, Odessa." Something in his voice stopped her mid-argument. She stood, dropped the tangled leather into his lap. "Fine," she snapped. "Show me how useless I am." He didn't answer that, just picked up the awl. Turned it over, ran a thumb along the dull edge. "Whetstone," he said. She fetched it. He worked in silence, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the small room, and Odessa stood back, arms crossed, watching his hands move with a fluid grace his legs would never have again. When he finished, he tossed the mended harness onto the floor between them. The stitching was flawless, tighter than anything she could have managed in a year of trying. She picked it up, tested it, didn't budge an inch. "There's a tear in the mule collar, too," she said, giving nothing away in her voice. "You'll have that done by morning." Garrick let out a low, rough sound. Not quite a laugh. Close enough. "Bring the saddle soap while you're at it," he said. "This place smells like a wet dog and your tack's a disgrace." She didn't smile. But something in her chest, some fist that had been clenched for 3 straight years, loosened just a fraction. For the first time since her husband died, she wasn't carrying this whole farm alone. By the end of that first month, the tools in the barn had never been sharper, the harnesses never sturdier, and Odessa found herself, without quite meaning to, working alongside his chair each evening, instead of alone, at her own small table, the two of them trading small tasks and smaller words, in the lamplight while outside the first real snows of the season began to fall. It was a gray morning in late October when the wagon crested the hill again, and Odessa knew the sound of those iron wheels before she even looked up from the coupe. Wade. She straightened, corn scattering forgotten from the bucket in her hand, and watched the wagon roll to a stop near the house. 2 men on horseback trailed behind him. Council men, faces she recognized from church, faces that had smiled polite and small, while the whole town laughed behind her back. About the widow and her charity case. They'd expected ruin. She could see it plain on their faces as they looked around the property. The woodpile stacked 10 feet high, the coop roof freshly patched, the porch swept clean. Disappointment, sharp and sour, crossed more than one of those smug faces. Wade climbed down, spat a stream of tobacco onto the frost-hard ground. "Well now," he said, walked toward her with that easy, terrible smile. "Still breathing, Odessa. Looking well enough? What do you want? Taxes are due tomorrow. He said it soft. Almost kind if you didn't know him. Bank sent me to do an inventory. See what we can auction to cover what you owe. The ground seemed to tilt under her, because the harvest had been thin this year, thinner than last, and she had nothing set aside to cover a debt like that, and Wade knew it, and that was exactly why he was smiling. I have until tomorrow, she said, stepping forward, planting herself between him and the barn. Get off my land, Wade. He reached out, shoved her shoulder. Not hard. Hard enough. The frost-slick ground did the rest, and she stumbled back, bucket clattering, corn scattering across the frozen dirt like something spilled and ruined. Don't get proud with me, Wade said. Low now. The smile gone thin and mean. You're a squatter as of tomorrow. We'll take the mule, the tools, whatever's worth. Thwack. The sound cracked across the yard like a gunshot. A hunting knife buried itself in the wooden post of the coop, not 2 inches from Wade's ear, still humming from the throw. Every head turned toward the porch. Garrick sat in his makeshift chair, shadowed under the overhang, a rifle resting easy across his lap like it had grown there. His pale eyes were locked on Wade with a stillness that had nothing calm about it. Nothing at all. Next one goes through your throat, he said. Quiet. No heat in it. Which was somehow worse than shouting. Wade's face went the color of ash. You're supposed to be. Not yet, Garrick said. Nobody moved. The 2 riders behind Wade had gone rigid in their saddles, hands hovering above pistols they'd already silently agreed not to reach for. Pick up the corn. Garrick said. Wade's jaw worked, humiliation and fear fighting a war across his face. I ain't picking up. The rifle came up an inch. The hammer clicked back, slow and deliberate, echoing across the frozen yard like a door. Closing on something final. Pick it up, Garrick said again, or you'll be picking up your own leg next. The silence stretched taut as a fence wire. Then, jerky and furious, Wade bent down, scooped the spilled corn into the bucket with shaking hands, stood, set it down hard at Odessa's feet without looking at her. We'll be back tomorrow, he said, with the sheriff. See how brave your cripple is then. He climbed back onto the buckboard, snapped the reins. The wagon rattled away down the frozen road, the 2 riders close behind, and Odessa stood in the ruin of scattered corn, chest heaving, breath fogging white in the cold. She walked to the coop, pulled the knife free from the post with a hard yank, wiped the blade clean on her apron, climbed the porch steps and stood in front of Garrick, who had already lowered the rifle, the fierce stillness draining out of his face and leaving something pale and tired behind it. She held the knife out, handle first. He took it, slid it into the sheath strapped to the chair. He's right, Garrick said quietly, looking out over the frost-bitten fields. They'll come back tomorrow. Odessa stood beside him on the porch, following his gaze out toward the same bleak horizon, the same road that had brought her nothing but ruin for 3 years running. Then we figure it out, she said. She didn't look down at him with pity. He didn't look up at her with shame, and out there on the porch, with the wind howling cold across the empty fields, something had settled between them that hadn't been there a month before. Something neither one of them had a name for yet. Something that felt, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, like they weren't standing alone against the world anymore. But that night, long after the lamps were out and the house had gone quiet, Odessa lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, turning one word over and over in the dark until it wore smooth as a river stone. Crane. Whoever he was. Whatever he'd done. She had a cold, creeping certainty, settling into her bones the same way the winter had, that the real danger to this farm hadn't come riding up on Wade's wagon at all. It was still out there somewhere, waiting, and it had a name. The sheriff never came that next morning. What came instead was frost. Hard, biting, the kind that turned the fields into sheets of cracked glass and made every breath feel like swallowing a blade. Odessa stood at the window before dawn, watching the road, waiting for the shape of a wagon that never showed, because Wade had said tomorrow, and tomorrow had come and gone, and nothing. Which should have felt like relief. It didn't. It felt like a held breath. Like standing under a barn roof you already know is going to fall, just waiting for the exact moment the beam finally gives. She turned from the window and found Garrick already watching her from his chair, pulled up close to the stove. A whetstone working slow circles against a blade he didn't need sharpened anymore. He'd been at it 20 minutes. She'd counted. "They're not coming," she said. "They're coming." He didn't look up. "Just not today." "How do you know that?" "Because men like Wade don't move fast when they're scared." The stone kept moving. Scrape, 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 and a man who throws a knife 2 inches from your skull without blinking. That scares a man like Wade plenty. She wanted to believe him. She almost did, except something in the back of her mind kept snagging on a single word. The one he'd choked out in his fever 4 nights running. The one that had crawled under her skin and never quite crawled back out. Crane, she hadn't asked him about it. Hadn't found the nerve or the right moment. Or maybe she just hadn't wanted to hear the answer badly enough to risk hearing it. But sitting there in the gray hush of that frozen morning, watching him work the blade with hands that had clearly done violence before, and would again, she decided the moment had finally come, whether either of them wanted it to or not. "Who's Crane?" she said. The stone stopped, just stopped. Mid-stroke, his whole body went still in that particular way she'd started to recognize. The stillness of a man bracing for a wound before it lands. "Where'd you hear that name?" "You said it." "Fever night." Grabbed my wrist near hard enough to break it, and said his name like you wanted to kill him. Silence, long enough that the fire popped twice in the stove before he answered. "I did want to kill him," Garrick said. "Still do, if I'm honest, which I generally try to be, even when it don't serve me, so who is he?" Garrick set the whetstone down, slow, deliberate. Like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying so long his arms had forgotten how to do anything else. "Was my partner," he said. "Trapping. Hunting. 6 years near enough, up in those mountains together. Man saved my life twice. I saved his 3 times. Not that he was ever counting the same way I was. A muscle worked in his jaw. We found a vein, up past Widow's Notch. Gold Odessa. Not a fortune, but enough. Enough to matter to 2 men who'd spent their whole lives, owning nothing but the clothes on their backs, and the traps in their hands. And the bear, there wasn't any bear." The words dropped into the room, and just sat there, heavy, final. Odessa felt something cold settle low in her stomach, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with the frost outside. "There was a knife," Garrick went on, voice flat now, "stripped of everything except the facts, because facts were easier to say than feelings, and he'd clearly decided a long time ago which one he could afford. In my back. While I was checking a trapline he told me to check, and when I turned around to ask him why, he was already walking away. Didn't even watch me fall a breath. Rough, bitten off at the end. Left me for the wolves to finish what he'd started, except the wolves never came. A bear did instead. Found me half dead in the snow, and I suppose you could call that mercy, seeing as it's the story Doc wrote down for the council. Bear attack. Tragic accident. Nobody asks any further questions about a man who's already dead from the waist down. Odessa didn't say anything for a long moment, because what was there to say? Sorry didn't cover it. Sorry never covered anything that mattered. "The vein," she said finally. "It's still up there, it's still up there." His eyes found hers, steady now, pale and hard as river ice. "And there's exactly one man alive who knows where it sits on a map. And it ain't Silas Crane, not anymore. You, me." She thought about that a moment, about the shape of it. About what it meant that a man could be handed off like a joke, dumped in her yard to die quiet in the cold, while somewhere out there another man walked free with blood on his hands, and a claim he had no right to. "That's why he did it," she said, slowly. "Not for the gold alone. For the map. For the only man left who knows where the gold is. That's why he did it." The fire popped again. Outside, wind rattled the shutters, low and constant, the sound of a winter that hadn't finished with them yet. "How'd he know you'd survive?" Odessa asked. "The knife. The cold. Any of it. He didn't." Something bitter twisted at the corner of Garrick's mouth. "Didn't figure I would. That was the whole point of leaving me the way he did. A dead man tells no tales, and a man too broken to chase him down might as well be dead for all the trouble he'd cause." He shook his head slow. Silas always did think small when it came to what a man could survive. Fatal mistake if you're the one doing the leaving. There's more, Garrick said. He reached down beside the cot, into the ruined pile of his old buckskin coat that Odessa had thrown in the rag barrel weeks back, thinking it fit for nothing but kindling. He'd fished it out at some point when she wasn't looking. She hadn't noticed until now. He drew his skinning knife. The blade slid free with a soft, dry whisper. Odessa's whole body went tight, some old animal instinct rising fast in her chest, but he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the collar of that coat, flipping it inside out, working the tip of the blade, under a line of sinew stitching she'd never once thought to examine. The hide parted. He dug 2 fingers into the gap and pulled free a small oiled pouch, dark with age. Tied shut with a leather cord gone stiff as wire, he upended it into his palm. 3 lumps of raw gold tumbled out, rough, ugly, gleaming dull even in the gray morning light. Odessa stared at them, didn't gasp, didn't reach for them either. You had that, she said, voice very quiet, very even. The kind of even that comes right before something breaks loose underneath it. This whole time, sewn into your coat, while I fed you my own rations. While I dragged a plow through mud by myself because the mule was too weak to pull it alone. I know, you let me bleed for this farm, Garrick. While you sat there with a fortune stitched into your collar, I was a dead man in a stranger's yard. He didn't flinch from it, didn't soften it. If I'd shown you gold on the first night, what's to stop you handing me straight to Wade for a cut of it? Or leaving me out for the coyotes yourself and keeping the whole pouch quiet? I wouldn't have. You didn't know that yet. Neither did I. His voice roughened at the edges. Up in the timber, you don't show a stranger your gold until you know for certain they ain't going to slit your throat over it. Took me this long to know it about you, Odessa. That's the truth of it. Plain as I can say it, she stood there. Anger and something else tangled together, so tight in her chest, she couldn't have pulled them apart if she'd tried. Because he was right. And being right didn't make it hurt any less. This isn't about trust, she said finally. Not really. Is it? No, it's Crane. He's not done. And you know he's not done, and that's why you're only telling me now. Garrick held out his hand. The gold sat heavy in his scarred palm, dull and unremarkable for something that had cost him the use of his legs and very nearly his life. Pay the taxman tomorrow, he said. Keep the rest hid. And listen to me. Close, Odessa, because I mean this plain, as I've ever meant anything. If a man comes through that gate calling himself Silas Crane, or any name that doesn't sit right in your gut, you get inside this house and you bar the door, and you let me handle what comes next. You understand me? She looked at his hand a long moment. At the gold, at the man then. She reached out and took it, snatched it, really. More temper in the motion than she meant to show, and her rough fingers brushed his scarred ones on the way. I'm charging you interest, she said, turning fast so he wouldn't see whatever her face was doing. Behind her, she heard something she hadn't heard from him yet. Not quite a laugh, close enough to count. The frost broke into a hard gray snow 2 days later, and Wade never did come back with the sheriff. He came alone, on foot, which told Odessa plenty before he'd even said a word. Because a man like Wade never walked anywhere he could ride, not unless riding meant admitting something he'd rather not admit. She met him at the gate. Didn't invite him past it. Come to collect, he said, though the bluster had gone thin and reedy since the last visit. His eyes kept sliding past her, toward the porch, toward the shadow of the doorway, where a rifle might or might not be waiting. Odessa reached into her apron pocket, pulled out one raw nugget of gold, and set it in his palm without ceremony, the way you'd hand a beggar a coin just to make him stop talking. Wade's whole face changed. That's the taxes, Odessa said. This year's, next year's, if the assayer weighs it fair, which he will, because I'll be standing there watching him do it. Consider whatever's left over a fee for never driving your wagon up my road again. Wade turned, the nugget over in his fingers stunned into something almost like silence, which was the first time in 3 years Odessa had seen the man manage it. Where'd a woman like you get gold? He said finally, suspicion creeping back into his voice. Quick as it had left it. Don't matter where. Matters that it's real. And it's yours, and you're leaving. He looked past her one more time. Toward the porch. Toward the shadow that hadn't moved this whole conversation. Though Odessa knew, could feel it in her spine, that the shadow had a rifle across its lap and a clear line down the whole length of the yard. This ain't finished, Wade muttered, but there was no fire in it anymore. Just the sour taste of a man who'd come, looking for a fight and left with nothing to fight over. He turned, walked back down the frozen road on foot, hunched against the wind, and Odessa stood at the gate until he was nothing but a dark speck against the white, and then she went back inside wide where it was warm, and where Garrick was watching her. From his chair, with an expression she couldn't quite read. "He'll talk," Garrick said. "Man like that can't help it. Talk to who? Anybody who'll listen. And somebody out there is listening, Odessa. Somebody's been listening a long while now." He looked toward the window, toward the white, nothing beyond it, and something in his face went distant and cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Gold don't stay quiet. Not in a town this small. Word'll travel. How far? Far as it needs to. She didn't ask him what that meant. She was starting to understand she didn't want to know the answer until she absolutely had to. That evening, sitting across from him at the table, she found herself studying the shape of his hands. The scars, the calluses, the steady, deliberate way. He moved them now, even without legs, to anchor the rest of him. A man built for the mountains, stranded on the plains, still finding ways to be useful in a body that had betrayed him. She thought of her husband, who'd had 2 good legs his whole life, and never once used them to carry a kindness toward her, and wondered, not for the first time, at the strange arithmetic of what made a man worth keeping. "You're staring now," Garrick said, without looking up from the harness in his lap. "Looking," she corrected. "Same thing." "No, it ain't," she said. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself smile at him, small and unguarded, before she caught herself and looked away. Winter settled in hard after that, the kind of winter the old-timers in Millbrook Ridge would still be talking about years later, if any of them lived long enough to do the talking. Snow piled to the eaves. Wind screamed across the plains with a sound like something grieving, and the farmhouse shrank down to 20 feet of heat and breath. And the particular closeness that happens when 2 people can't get more than a room's width away from each other for weeks on end. Garrick had rigged pulleys to the ceiling beams, thick hemp rope, iron rings, a whole contraption he'd built one grinding. Sweat-soaked afternoon while Odessa held the ladder, and pretended not to be amazed at the raw stubbornness of him, hauling himself up on his own arms, just to drill a hole in a beam 8 feet off the ground. Now he could move himself, bed to chair, chair to table, without her hands under his arms, and though he never said so, Odessa understood exactly what that meant to him. A man who'd had every shred of independence stripped off him in one violent afternoon, clawing back an inch of it at a time. She admired that. More than she let herself say out loud. The days folded into each other. Butchering the hog before the deep freeze. Rendering lard in a pot that filled the whole house with a heavy, greasy smell she'd stopped minding weeks ago. Garrick mending harness after harness, sharpening every blade on the property twice over just to have something to do with his hands. And in the evenings, when the wind howled, loud enough to make conversation feel almost private even in a one-room house, they talked, not about Crane, not about gold, about smaller things, easier things, about the mountains he'd grown up chasing elk through, the particular blue of a sky at 11,000 feet that he swore no painter could ever get right. About the first winter he'd spent alone as a young man, 19 years old, and half convinced he'd freeze before spring. And how a Ute, trapper twice his age, had taken him in without a word of judgment and taught him things about surviving cold that no book back east could have. About the husband she'd buried 3 winters back. A man who'd spent a decade telling her she was built for pulling stumps and not much else, and how she'd believed him so long she'd nearly forgotten. There was another way to hear it. "He was wrong," Garrick said one night, low, not looking at her directly, like the words cost him something to spend. About the stumps, Dessa's hands went still over the mending in her lap. "Wasn't asking your opinion, mountain man." Giving it anyway. She didn't answer that. Didn't trust her voice to do anything but crack if she tried. Some nights, when the wind was at its worst, she'd catch herself remembering the first year of her marriage. The way her husband used to comment on the size of her plate at supper, the careful way he'd measure her portions like he was doing her a favor. She'd never told anyone that. Had barely admitted it to herself. But something about the quiet of these long winter evenings, the steady presence of a man who never once flinched at the size of her or the strength of her hands, made the old shame feel further away than it had in years. It was a Tuesday, deep in January, when the soap slipped out of her hands during the evening wash and skittered under the edge of his cot, and she groaned. Pure exhaustion, pure defeat, and bent down to fish for it half-dressed and too tired to care. "You'll pull something doing that," Garrick said. Voice rough, with sleep he hadn't quite been in, she froze, straightened. Face burning hotter than the stove at her back. He was propped on one elbow, watching her, and he reached down without asking, retrieved the soap himself, and didn't hand it over right away, just looked at her. Really looked, the way she hadn't let herself be looked at in longer than she wanted to admit. "Close your eyes," she snapped, arms crossing over her chest on pure reflex. "Ain't a picture show." He didn't close them. "You fight your own shadow, Odessa." "I don't know what that means." "Means you carry yourself like a woman waiting to be told she's too much." His voice dropped lower. "Stia dear. Down in the settlements, they like their women small, breakable. Something you keep behind glass." A pause. The wind screaming outside filled the space where his next words gathered themselves. "Up in the timber, breakable gets you killed. You don't survive a mountain being small, Odessa. You survive it being exactly what you are." She stood there, half-dressed, soap forgotten in his outstretched hand, heart hammering loud enough. She was half convinced he could hear it over the storm. "There's nothing wrong with a woman who can hold her ground," Garrick said, quieter now. Almost gentle. In the rough, unpracticed way he seemed to manage everything. "Nothing wrong with you at all." She took the soap from his hand. Their fingers brushed. Neither one of them pulled away as fast as maybe they should have. Nothing else happened that night, nothing needed to. But something had shifted, quiet and permanent as a stone, settling deeper into a riverbed, and both of them felt it, and neither of them said so out loud, because some things you don't rush toward. Some things you just let happen, slow. The way spring happens after a long enough winter. The first warning came in the shape of a stranger. It was early February. The cold still brutal, but the day's beginning, just barely, just at the edges, to stretch a few minutes longer than the night before. Odessa had ridden into Millbrook Ridge for supplies, leaving Garrick behind, with the rifle across his lap, and strict instructions not to do anything heroic while she was gone. Instructions she fully expected him to ignore. The second, her back was turned. The town felt different the moment she stepped down off the wagon, because there was a man standing outside the mercantile, leaning easy against the porch post, like he owned the whole street, and every single reporter walking past him gave him the kind of deference usually reserved for bank presidents and preachers. He was tall. Not as tall as Garrick. Nobody was, but tall enough, and dressed too fine for a frontier town in February. A wool coat with a fur collar, boots that had never once seen mud. He had the kind of face that photographed well and lied easy, the sort of handsome that made a person's guard go down before their good sense had a chance to weigh in. "Afternoon," he said, tipping his hat as she passed. Smile like a closed door, with a friendly knock painted on the front of it. Odessa nodded, kept walking. Didn't like the way his eyes tracked her all the way to the mercantile door, unhurried, cataloging something she couldn't name. Inside Miller, the shopkeeper was practically vibrating with the news, the way small-town men always vibrated with news that had nothing to do with them. Personally. "You seen him yet?" Miller asked, weighing out her flour with hands that shook slightly. Though whether from cold or excitement, Odessa couldn't say. "Mr. Crane, come in on the coach 3 days back, buying up mining claims all through the territory, so he says. Talks awful friendly for a man with that much money." Odessa's whole body went still. "Crane," she repeated. "Careful. Flat, Silas Crane. struck a partnership up in the high country a few years back, or so the story goes. Says his old partner passed, God rest him, and he's come down to see what's owed. Real generous fella. Miller shook his head, admiring. Oblivious. Even offered old Wade a stake in a claim, if you can believe that. Man never met a fool he didn't like the smell of. The flour sack sat forgotten on the counter between them. Odessa's hands had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with February. Old partner passed. God rest him. He'd told the whole town Garrick was dead. Which meant if word ever traveled back to Silas Crane that the mountain man he'd stabbed and left for wolves was alive, breathing, and sitting on a farm not 4 miles outside town. She didn't finish the thought. Didn't let herself. Just paid for the flour, with hands that weren't quite steady, and walked back out onto the street, and found Silas Crane still leaning against that porch post, watching her with the particular patience of a man who has already decided, "You're worth watching, ma'am," he said again, as she passed. "Don't believe I caught your name." "Didn't throw it," Odessa said, and kept walking, and didn't look back, though she could feel his eyes on her the entire length of the street, all the way to the wagon, all the way until the town had shrunk small behind her and the frozen road stretched out white and empty toward home, toward Garrick, toward the one truth in this whole territory that could get them both killed if the wrong man learned it, before she had the chance to warn him. She drove the mules harder than she meant to, the wagon jolting over frozen ruts, her heart pounding a rhythm that had nothing to do with the cold, and everything to do with the man she'd left leaning against that porch post, smiling like he had all the time in the world, because men like Silas Crane always did. She found him on the porch when she got back, Shawn, rifle across his lap, same as always, watching the road the way he'd taken to watching it every single day now. Like a man who'd learned the hard way that trouble announces itself before it arrives. If you know how to listen. He read her face before she said a single word. What happened? Crane's in town. The rifle didn't move. His whole body went rigid instead, still as stone, still as something carved rather than born. Say his name again. Silas Crane. Buying mining claims. Told the whole town his old partner's dead. God rest him. He said, "Sweet as you please." Her voice shook on the last of it, more than she wanted it to. "He's making friends, Garrick. He's talking to Wade." Wade offered him a stake. In a claim. Something crossed Garrick's face then, quick and dark, gone before she could fully name it. Fear, maybe. Or something colder than fear. The particular calculation of a man who has just watched two separate threats find each other and shake hands. "He knows the veins on this land," Garrick said slowly. "He's known since the day he stuck that knife in my back. What he don't know, what he can't know, not yet, is that I'm alive to say otherwise. And if he finds out," Garrick looked at her, long, steady, the wind picking up around them, cold and constant, carrying the smell of snow still to come. "Then he comes here," he said, "and he doesn't come alone, and he doesn't come polite. Man who'll put a knife in his own partner's back over a claim ain't a man who negotiates twice." Odessa sat down hard on the porch step beside his chair, because her legs had gone weak in a way 3 years of hard labor had never once managed, and she needed the wood under her, solid, real. Something to hold on to while the whole shape of their winter rearranged itself into something far more dangerous than frost and taxes. "So what do we do?" she said. "We wait." His hand found hers on the porch boards between them. Rough palm, warm despite the cold, and we get ready. And whatever happens, Odessa, whatever comes up that road, you don't run. Running's what he wants, man like Crane. He wants you scared and small and easy to push off this land. You give him the opposite of that, you understand me. You give him exactly what you are. She looked at their hands, at the shape of his fingers around hers, calloused, sure, holding on like an anchor thrown into rough water. "I don't run," she said. "Never have, I know." Something almost like a smile ghosted across his mouth. "It's the first thing I liked about you. If you want the truth of it." They sat together on that porch a long while, watching the light fail over the frozen fields, and though neither one of them said it plain, both understood that whatever came next was going to test every ounce of stubbornness either of them had left. and that they'd rather face it side by side than any other way. 3 days passed in a held breath. Nothing came up the road. No wagon, no rider, no sign at all that the town of Millbrook Riverview remembered the farm existed, and that silence should have felt like relief. It didn't. It felt exactly like the stillness before a storm rolls over a ridgeline. That particular hush the whole prairie goes quiet with, right before the wind changes and everything gets worse at once. On the fourth night, Odessa woke to the smell of smoke, not wood smoke, not the stove banked low and familiar the way it always was by midnight. This was sharper, wrong. The kind of smoke that made every animal instinct in her body scream awake before her conscious mind had even finished catching up. Garrick, I smell it. He was already hauling himself upright, already reaching for the rifle propped against the wall, his voice stripped down to something flat and fast and entirely without panic, which somehow made the whole thing more terrifying, not less. Barn. She was out the door before he finished the word. The cold hit her like a slap, and then the light hit her worse, orange, furious. Licking up the side of the barn in a sheet that had clearly been burning a while before the smell reached the house. The animals inside were screaming. The mule, the 2 remaining hogs. A sound like nothing Odessa had ever heard before and would never, for the rest of her life, be able to fully unhear. The mule! She screamed, already running, boots slipping on frozen ground, lungs burning with cold and smoke, both at once. Behind her, she heard the grinding scrape of iron wheels, moving fast across the porch boards, faster than she'd thought the chair could manage, and some distant, disbelieving part of her mind registered that Garrick was coming too, chair wheels kijaying and lurching against the frozen ruts of the yard. And there was no time to tell him to stay back. No time for anything except the fire and the screaming, and the desperate animal need to save what little they had left. She threw the barn door open. Smoke rolled out thick and black, and through it she could see the mule rearing against its tether, eyes rolled white with terror, flames already climbing the far wall where the hay was stacked. Odessa, Garrick's voice, sharp behind her. The tether's on the left post. Cut it, don't untie it, you don't have the time. She didn't have a knife. She grabbed the pitchfork instead, drove the handle hard against the leather strap until it split, and the mule bolted past her, so fast it nearly took her off her feet. Out into the cold and the dark, and away from the fire that was climbing faster now, hungrier, eating through the old dry wood like it had been waiting its whole life for exactly this chance. She turned for the hogs. Leave them, Garrick's voice, closer now. Right at the door. Roof's going, Odessa, get out. She didn't leave them. Couldn't. Not after everything this winter had already cost them both, and she wrenched the pen door open, drove the animals out screaming and squealing into the yard. And by the time she staggered back out into the cold herself, coughing, eyes streaming, half the barn roof had already caved in behind her in a roar of sparks and collapsing timber. Garrick was there. Right there. Chair wheels sunk halfway into the mud at the edge of the yard, close enough that the heat of the fire lit his whole face orange and fierce, and he grabbed her arm the second she was in reach and hauled her down beside him. Away from the worst of the heat, both of them coughing, both of them staring at the ruin of what had taken her husband a decade to build, and her 3 years alone to keep standing. It wasn't lightning, Garrick said, when he'd caught enough breath to speak. His voice had gone hard as flint. Wrong season, wrong wind. Somebody said it, somebody said it. She looked at him. At the fury banked deep in those pale eyes. Fury that had nothing to do with the fire and everything. To do with a name they both knew, without saying it out loud. A warning, she said. A warning. He was quiet a moment, watching the flames finish what they'd started. The barn, nothing now but a black skeleton against the orange sky. Which means he knows, or close enough to knowing that it doesn't matter anymore. He's found out I'm alive, Odessa. Or he's found out something close enough to it, that he's testing the water before he wades in all the way. The fire began to die down, choked by its own hunger. Nothing left to burn but embers and the frozen mud beneath them, hissing where the heat met snow. Odessa sat in the wet cold, arm still gripped tight in Garrick's hand, and became aware, slowly, of something strange happening beneath the grip. His hand wasn't just holding her arm. His leg had moved, just slightly. Just a twitch, barely perceptible. The kind of thing a person might dismiss entirely if they weren't sitting close enough, watching close enough to catch it in the firelight. Garrick. Her voice came out strange. Careful, your leg. He looked down. Frowned, the way a man frowns at something he doesn't trust enough to hope about yet. Do it again, she said. Try. He concentrated, jaw tight, and for a long moment nothing happened at all. Nothing but the wind and the dying fire, and the two of them holding a breath neither one wanted to let out. Then, small, barely anything. A twitch no bigger than a heartbeat. His knee shifted an inch against the frozen ground. Neither of them said anything, because what was there to say? Months of nothing, months of dead weight and phantom pain, and a body that had given up telling him anything true. And now, in the worst hour of the worst night, some small ember of feeling flickering back to life, in a place he'd buried all hope of ever feeling again. Don't, Garrick said finally. Rough, almost angry, though the anger wasn't aimed at her. Don't say anything about it. Not yet. Things that come back sudden have a habit of leaving again just as sudden. And I can't. He stopped, swallowed hard. I can't lose it twice. Odessa reached out, covered his hand with hers, the way she'd started doing without quite noticing when she'd begun. Then we don't say anything, she said. We just watch. Together, he looked at her a long moment in the dying firelight, smoke curling up between them into the cold black sky, and something passed across his face that had nothing to do with fear or fury or Silas Crane at all. Together, he said, like the word was new in his mouth. Like he was trying the shape of it, out for the first time and finding, to his own quiet astonishment, that it fit. They rebuilt what they could of the barn, over the following days, though rebuilt was generous, patched, propped, made just barely serviceable enough to keep what animals remained from freezing before spring. Garrick worked from his chair, directing, hammering nails into low boards he could reach, and Odessa hauled and lifted, and did the climbing neither of them said out loud that he couldn't manage yet, though the leg kept twitching, small and stubborn. Every few days a little more, word of the fire spread through Millbrook Ridge, fast, the way word of anything spread in a town, with nothing better to do than talk. Some folks called it bad luck. A stray ember, a careless lantern. Odessa knew better, Garrick knew better. And somewhere in town, dressed too fine for the weather, smiling that closed-door smile at anyone who'd give him the time. Silas Crane knew better than anyone. It was a week later, hauling supplies again, that Odessa finally saw him up close. He was standing outside the assayer's office this time, in conversation with Wade, the two of them thick as old friends, despite having known each other, by Odessa's best reckoning, less than a month. Wade's face had that particular hungry brightness it always got around money, and Crane's face had the particular patience of a man who understood exactly how easy that hunger made a fool to use. She tried to walk past without being seen. Didn't manage it, Mrs. Vane. Crane's voice, smooth as poured oil, stopping her mid-step. I don't believe we've been properly introduced. She turned, made herself meet his eyes, though every instinct in her bodies was screaming to keep walking, keep her head down, keep the whole shape of her life as far from this man's attention as she could manage. Don't see the need, she said. I hear you've had some trouble out at your place. His smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes sharpened, just slightly, the way a hawk's eyes sharpen right before it drops. Barn fire, was it? Terrible thing, this time of year. Man could lose everything in a night like that. Man could, she agreed. Didn't, though. No. Crane tilted his head, studying her with an interest that made her skin crawl, slow and thorough, like he was pricing something at auction. Heard you took in a cripple last fall. Charity case, from what Wade tells me. Big man, hunter. Before his accident, the word accident landed heavy and deliberate. She heard the weight of it. Understood exactly what he was testing, fishing, feeling out with the careful patience of a man who already suspected the truth and simply hadn't confirmed it yet. Man's dead weight, Odessa said, flat, giving him nothing. Can't walk, can't work. Some days I regret taking him at all. It cost her something to say it, more than she expected. But she watched Crane's face carefully as she said it. Watched the way his shoulders eased a fraction, the way the sharpness behind his eyes dulled back down to ordinary curiosity, and understood she'd bought them something with that lie. Time, maybe, not much. But something. Shame, Crane said. Man like that. Must be a burden on a woman managing alone. I manage fine, I'm sure you do. His smile widened, and something about the width of it made her stomach turn over slow and cold. You've got good land out there, Mrs. Vane. Fine land. I'd be happy to make you an offer, should you ever tire of managing it alone. Generous offer. More than fair market, not selling. Everyone sells eventually. He said it soft. Almost kind, the way a man says something cruel when he wants it to sound like mercy. Questions only ever when. And at what cost to them? If they wait too long to say yes, he tipped his hat. Turned back to Wade, who was watching the whole exchange with the eager, oblivious hunger of a dog waiting for scraps. And Odessa walked away with her heart, hammering so loud, she was half certain the whole street could hear it. She didn't stop walking until she was well clear of town, until the wagon wheels were grinding steady over the frozen road home, and even then her hands wouldn't quite stop shaking on the reins, because she'd looked into the eyes of the man who'd left Garrick for dead in the snow. And she understood with a cold certainty that settled somewhere deep in her chest and refused to leave, that he already knew far more than he was letting on. That the offer wasn't really an offer at all. It was a countdown. She told Garrick everything the moment she got home, every word, every look, the particular ugly patience in Crane's voice when he'd said the word accident. He listened without interrupting, jaw tight, hands still on the arms of his chair, and when she finished, the silence that followed stretched long enough that the fire in the stove had time to pop 3 times before either of them spoke again. He knows, Garrick said finally. He suspects. Same thing, this far along. He looked toward the window, toward the dark fields beyond it, buried under 3 feet of snow that wouldn't melt for another 2 months, at least. Man like Crane don't make an offer that generous on land that thin unless he already knows exactly what's sitting under it, and exactly who's sitting on top of it. So what do? Garrick was quiet a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had gone low and rough, stripped down to something almost gentle underneath the hardness. We survive the winter, he said, same as we've been doing. And when the thaw comes, when the roads open up enough to matter, we go into that town together. Not hiding, not lying about who's dead and who ain't. His eyes found hers, steady, unflinching. Because a lie only holds so long as it's useful, Odessa, and we're running out of use for this one fast. She sat down across from him, the fire crackling low between them, snow ticking, soft and endless against the window glass. And if he comes before the thaw, she said. If he doesn't wait, then we'll be ready. His hand found hers again, the way it had taken to doing more and more these past weeks. Warm and sure, despite everything the winter had thrown at them both. We've survived worse than one man's greed, you and I. We'll survive this too. She wanted to believe him. Needed to, the way a person needs solid ground, under a bridge they're already halfway across. But that night, lying awake and listening to the wind howl against the shutters, Odessa Vane found herself doing something she hadn't done in 3 long years. She found herself praying. Not for herself, not even entirely, for the farm. For the man in the next room, whose legs were slowly, impossibly, beginning to remember how to feel again, and who was going to need every ounce of that strength, every inch of it, for whatever was still coming up that frozen road toward them both. Because winter, she understood now, had never been the real danger at all. Winter, at least, played fair. The thaw came in March, and it came ugly. Snow didn't melt so much as it surrendered, all at once, turning 3 feet of white into a blacksacat, sucking bog that swallowed boot, prints whole, and dragged the whole farm down into mud the color of old iron. The creek swelled past its banks. The road into Millbrook Ridge turned to soup, and somewhere under all that mud, Odessa knew the ground was finally soft enough for a man to travel it again. Which meant Crane could come whenever he pleased and now. Which meant the waiting was over. She stood on the porch that first warm morning, watching Garrick work the lower field from his sled. The flat pine board he'd built himself, strapped tight around his waist, hauling himself hand over hand through the muck the way he'd done all winter whenever the chair wheels sank too deep to trust. Except something was different now. She'd been watching close enough these last weeks to see it. His right leg dragged less than it used to. Not gone. Not healed. Not by a long stretch. Doc back east would have had a dozen poker words for what was and wasn't possible about a spine, crushed the way his had been. But there was something there now that hadn't been there in October. A stubborn flicker of feeling working its way back up through nerve and muscle, one cold morning at a time, the same way spring worked its way back into ground that had frozen solid enough to break a plow. He hadn't told anyone. Hadn't even fully let himself believe it. Some days, she could see that plain on his face. The way he'd test the leg quiet, alone, when he thought she wasn't looking, then shut the hope back down fast, like a man closing a door on a draft he couldn't afford to let in. She loved him for that too, the stubbornness of it. The refusal to hope out loud until hope had earned its keep. She was still watching him work the field when the wagon crested the hill, not Wade's wagon. Wade didn't own anything half so fine. This one had proper springs, dark lacquered wood, 2 matched horses instead of tired mules, and Odessa's stomach dropped straight through the porch boards the second she recognized the shape of the man driving it. Silas Crane. He wasn't alone. 2 riders flanked the wagon, hard-faced men she didn't recognize, the kind of men who got hired for jobs that didn't require asking questions. And in the wagon bed behind Crane, wrists bound, face gray with fear and something worse than fear. Wade. Garrick. Her voice cracked across the yard, sharper than she meant it. Garrick, get up here. He was already turning the sled, already hauling himself back toward the house with a speed she'd never seen him manage. Mud flying off his gloved hands, and by the time the wagon rolled to a stop at the gate, he'd made it as far as the porch steps, chair waiting there where she'd left it, and he wrenched himself up into it with a violence that spoke louder than any words could have. Crane climbed down slow, unhurried. A man who had never once in his life needed to rush toward anything, because the world had always waited for him instead. Mrs. Vane, he tipped his hat, smiled that same closed-door smile, except now there was nothing friendly painted on it at all, and Mr. Thorne. Alive after all, funny thing. Hearing a dead man's name spoken so casual around town all winter, and then finding out he's not so dead as everybody thought. Garrick said nothing. His hand had already found the rifle propped against the chair. Wouldn't, Crane said, easy, nodding toward the 2 riders flanking him, both of whom had already drawn, both of whom had the flat, patient look of men who'd done this kind of work before and wouldn't lose sleep doing it again. 3 of us, 1 of you, and your lady friend standing right there in the open besides. Let's not make this uglier than it needs to be. You made it ugly the day you put a knife in my back, Garrick said, voice like gravel dragged over stone. Nothing you say now changes that math. Crane's smile flickered, just slightly. The first honest thing Odessa had seen cross his face since she'd met him. I gave you a chance, he said. Told you the vein was worth more split 3 ways, with the right buyer, than 2 ways, between fools who'd have drunk the profit dry in a season. You wanted to be stubborn about it. Wanted to be honorable. He said the word like it tasted bad in his mouth. Look, we're honorable. Got you. Got me a farm, Garrick said. Got me her. His eyes didn't leave Crane's face. What'd your way get you, Silas? Besides a guilty conscience, you're clearly still working overtime to bury. Something dark passed behind Crane's eyes. I heard you found your feet again, he said, changing tack. Voice gone soft and needling. Some of it. Anyway. Heard it from Wade here, actually, before he found himself in rather a lot of debt to me, and rather short on ways to pay it back. He glanced toward the wagon, toward Wade's ashen face, and something almost like amusement crossed his features. Man's been feeding me every scrap of news off this farm for weeks. Fires. Feeling coming back in a dead man's legs. Whole town thinks I've been buying claims out of simple ambition. Truth is, I've just been waiting. Patient as a spider, Mrs. Vane. Waiting to see exactly how much of my old partner had survived and exactly what he intended to do about it. Odessa's eyes cut to Wade, to the wagon. to the ropes at his wrists. "You sold us out," she said. Not loud, flat. The kind of flat that carries further than shouting ever could. "For what, Wade?" "A stake in a claim that was never yours to begin with." Wade's face crumpled. Whatever pride he'd walked into this valley with had clearly been ground down to nothing over the winter, one debt at a time, one whispered threat at a time, until there was nothing left of the man but fear and shame in roughly equal measure, he said. "He'd forgive what I owed," Wade said, voice cracking. "Said all I had to do was watch, report back. I didn't know he meant to." He stopped. Swallowed hard. "I didn't know it'd come to this." "You never do," Odessa said. "That's always been your particular gift, Wade. Never knowing, right up until it's too late to matter." Crane raised a hand, mild, almost bored, cutting off whatever was about to happen between them. "Sentiments touching," he said. "Truly. But I've got a proposition, and I'd rather we get to it before this mud swallows my boots whole." He reached into his coat, drew out a folded paper, held it up between two fingers. "Deed transfer. Already drawn up. Already witnessed by a magistrate 2 counties over, who owes me a debt of his own. All it needs is your signature, Mrs. Vane, and this whole unpleasant business ends peaceful. You get paid fair, more than fair. And Mr. Thorne here gets to live out whatever's left of his broken life somewhere far away from my mining operation." "And if I don't sign," Odessa said. Crane's smile didn't waver. "Then my men here take that rifle off Mr. Thorne's lap before he can raise it," he said. Still mild, still pleasant, the pleasantness somehow worse than any shout could have been. "And we have a considerably less friendly conversation about deeds and widows, and how very easy it is for a woman alone on the frontier." Come spring flooding. The yard went silent except for the wind, and the distant lowing of the mule in its patched-together barn, and the slow, steady drip of melting snow off the porch eaves. Odessa felt Garrick's eyes on her, felt the whole weight of the decision, balanced there between them, and understood with sudden clarity that this was the moment. Not the fire, not the fever, not even the first cruel joke that had dumped him bleeding into her yard back in October. This, right here, I've got a proposition of my own. Garrick said. Crane's eyebrows rose, faint amusement flickering back across his face. "Do you now? You said 3 against 1. Garrick's hand rested easy on the rifle, not raising it, not yet, just resting, the way a man rests a hand on something he trusts himself to use exactly when needed, and not 1 second before. "Except you did your figuring wrong, Silas, same as you always did. Man never could count past his own greed. Enlighten me. You forgot the mule. For 1 absurd second." Confusion flickered across Crane's face, and in that half-second of confusion, Odessa moved. She'd spent the whole winter learning this land's every trick, every hidden advantage a farm could offer a person desperate enough to use them, and she'd spent the last 5 minutes of this conversation quietly, carefully, working her boot heel deeper and deeper into the loosened mud at the base of the gatepost, the same post that held the whole sagging weight of the fence line taut across the yard. The fence Garrick had rigged back in February, with a length of chain and a counterweight neither of them had ever actually needed to use. She kicked the post, it gave. The chain snapped taut, the counterweight dropped, and the whole rigged section of fence swung hard and fast across the yard, exactly where Crane's 2 riders stood, catching one of them full in the chest and sending him sprawling into the mud, his pistol firing wild into the sky as he fell. The second rider spun toward the sound, and that was all the opening Garrick needed. The rifle came up, 1 shot. Clean, precise, the kind of shot only a man who'd spent a lifetime hunting elk across impossible terrain could have made from a sitting position with his own legs carrying him beneath the chair. The pistol flew from the second rider's hand, and he went down clutching his wrist, screaming, and it was over in less time than it takes to describe it. Crane stood frozen, alone now, his deed transfer still clutched in one gloved hand, his face gone the color of old ash. "You're supposed to be crippled," he said, and his voice, for the first time since he'd climbed down off that wagon, actually shook. "I am," Garrick said. He hauled himself upright out of the chair, slow, unsteady. One hand braced hard against the porch post, his bad leg trembling under weight it hadn't held in 5 long months. and stood there, swaying, massive, undeniable, the wind cutting across the muddy yard between them. Just not as crippled as you were counting on. Odessa watched him stand, watched 5 months of pain and pulleys and stubborn, silent hope collapse, down into this one impossible moment, and felt something in her chest crack, wide open, grief and joy so tangled together she couldn't have separated them if her life had depended on it. Crane took a step back, then another. His eyes darted to his fallen men, groaning in the mud, then to the rifle still leveled steady in Garrick's hands. Despite the visible tremor running through his whole body from the effort of simply standing. "This isn't finished," Crane said. The same tired, empty threat Wade had offered back in October, and it landed exactly as hollow now as it had then. "It is, though," Odessa said. She'd crossed the yard while he was distracted, and now she stood close enough that Crane had to look up slightly to meet her eyes, which seemed to unsettle him more than the rifle had. "Because that deed's worthless without my signature, and I'm not signing it. And the whole town of Millbrook Ridge is going to hear, before this week is out, exactly what kind of man buys up claims with a knife in an old partner's back. Wade's going to tell them." She glanced toward the wagon, toward Wade's stricken face. "Aren't you, Wade?" Wade said nothing for a long moment. Then, slow, something shifted behind his eyes. Shame curdling, finally painfully, into something like resolve. "I'll tell them," he said quietly. "Everything." Crane's jaw tightened. He looked between the three of them. The woman who wouldn't sign, the man who wasn't as broken as promised, the fool who'd befuddled his spine 3 years too late to matter, and understood, with the particular clarity of a gambler who has just watched his whole hand collapse at once, that there was nothing left here worth the risk of staying. "Get up," he snapped at his men, and they hauled themselves out of the mud, one cradling a wrist that would need setting, the other still winded from the fence. "We're leaving." He climbed back into the wagon, snapped the reins hard enough that the horses startled, and the wagon lurched away down the muddy road, back toward town, back toward whatever reckoning was waiting for him there. Once word finally traveled, Odessa didn't watch him go. She was already turning toward Garrick, who had sunk back down into his chair the moment the danger passed. Chest heaving sweat, standing out on his forehead despite the cold, his whole body trembling with the effort of everything he'd just forced it to do. "You could have fallen," she said, kneeling beside him in the mud. Hands framing his face, checking him over with the same rough, thorough care she'd used on him back in October, except everything about the touch was different now. "You could have hurt yourself worse. Wouldn't have mattered." He caught her wrist, held it against his jaw. "Wasn't going to let him take this from us. Not the farm. Not you." His pale eyes, exhausted and fierce all at once, found hers. "Not after everything it cost to get here." She pressed her forehead against his, right there in the mud, in the wreckage of the fence and the fading echo of gunfire, and neither one of them said anything else for a long moment. Because there wasn't anything left to say that the silence didn't already say better. Wade told the truth. It took him 3 days to work up the nerve. 3 days of sitting in the Millbrook Ridge jail on Odessa's insistence. Cooling off, sobering up, staring at the particular wreckage he'd made of his own conscience. But on the 4th day, in front of the sheriff, and half the town crowded into the assayer's office to hear it, he told every ugly detail. The debts, the bribes, the fire he'd been paid to help arrange, though he swore, weeping, that he hadn't known Crane meant to burn the barn down around a living man's legs. Nobody in that room looked at Wade with anything but disgust. Nobody looked at Odessa and Garrick with pity anymore either. The whispers stopped. What replaced them was something closer to respect, grudging, unpracticed. The kind of town only learns once it's been proven wrong about somebody. Crane never came back. Word traveled fast once Wade's confession spread, fast enough that whatever claims he'd been quietly buying up through the territory turned suddenly deeply unprofitable the moment his name got tied publicly to attempted murder and land fraud, both. He vanished sometime in April, and though Odessa half expected to spend the rest of her life glancing over her shoulder for him, the months passed and he never showed his face in that valley again. Summer came slow and generous that year, But the kind of summer the plains only offered once in a while, as if apologizing for every brutal winter that came before it. Garrick's legs never came back all the way. Doc back east, when Odessa finally wrote asking, said as much as she'd already guessed. That some feeling had likely survived the injury, after all, buried deep, slowly finding its way back through nerve pathways nobody fully understood. But that a full recovery, the kind where a man walked freely across open ground the way he once had, simply wasn't in the cards. Not for him, not for anybody with an injury like his. Garrick took the news better than Odessa expected. Better, maybe, than she'd have taken it herself. Didn't need all of it back, he told her, one evening in late June, sitting on the porch with his legs stretched out in front of him. Weight braced on a set of crutches he'd carved and fitted himself over the spring, sturdy oak, worn smooth now from months of use, needed enough to stand. Enough to work this land beside you, instead of just watching you work it alone. He looked at her, something warm and unguarded in his face that had taken all winter and all spring to fully arrive there. Got exactly enough for that. Don't need the rest. She sat down beside him on the step, close enough their shoulders touched, and looked out over the fields. Full now, green, thick with wheat that would come in heavier this harvest than any she'd managed alone in 3 long years of trying. We built a good spring, she said. Built a good life, Garrick said. Spring was just the start of it. She turned to look at him, at the beard he'd finally trimmed back once the weather warmed, at the pale eyes that had gone soft instead of hard, somewhere. Over the long months between October and June, at the hands that had once thrown a knife 2 inches from a man's ear and now, more often, simply held hers, steady, sure, without a single word needed to explain why. Marry me, she said. Plain. No decoration on it at all. Because that had never been how the two of them talked to each other. Not once. Not from the very first night on this porch. Garrick didn't answer right away. He reached over instead, took her hand in both of his, calloused and scarred and warm, and turned it over slow, studying the shape of it, like he was memorizing something he intended to keep for the rest of his life. Only, if you're doing the asking because you mean it, he said finally. Not out of some notion that you owe me for standing up in that mud back in March. I don't owe you anything, mountain man. She pulled her hand free just long enough to cup his jaw, turning his face toward hers. I'm asking, because this farm was never mine alone to begin with. Not really. Not since the day Wade dumped you bleeding in my yard and I decided, against every ounce of good sense I had left, that I wasn't going to let you die out there. Best decision that fool Wade ever forced on either one of us, Garrick said. Something in his voice cracked just slightly, rough and honest, the closest thing to tears she'd ever heard from him. Best decision, she agreed. He kissed her then, slow, unhurried, the kind of kiss 2 people share when they've already survived. The worst a winter can throw at them, and understand bone deep that nothing left to come could possibly measure up to what they'd already carried through together. They married that September, in the yard, under a sky gone the particular gold color the plains only wore right before harvest. Half the town came, the same town that had once laughed behind cupped hands at the widow and her charity case. And if any bitterness lingered in Odessa's chest about that particular irony, she let it go somewhere over the course of that golden afternoon. Watching Garrick stand at her side on legs that would never fully carry him the way they once had, but carried him exactly far enough to stand beside her. Far enough to build a life neither one of them had ever dared hope for, back when they were just 2 broken, discarded, dumped together in the mud and expected to die. Quiet, where nobody would have to watch, the West, Odessa had come to understand, was never kind to the soft or the fragile or the easily broken. It never had been. It rewarded instead the stubborn, the scarred, the ones who'd been thrown away by everyone else, and simply refused, out of pure bull-headed spite, if nothing else, to lie down and stop breathing. She and Garrick hadn't just survived that first cruel winter. They'd taken every insult the town of Millbrook Ridge had ever aimed at them. The fat widow, the crippled mountain man. 2 death warrants dressed up as charity. And they'd built something out of it that no amount of cruelty could ever tear back down again. Not a joke anymore, a home.